Good to go.
Welcome to the Plainview Church of Christ in our short series on the Christian and mental illness, or the Christian and mental health. It is actually in real time. This is Sunday, May the 31st, and I'm in the auditorium with a couple of guys, and we're recording this series all in one setting. That's why I'm not going to change shirts, the whole thing. Somebody thought it was important to mention that. I remember going to an event several years ago when my health required me to have a babysitter, and my daughter ended up being the person to drive me to this place to speak. And when we walked in, here's the poster advertising the event, and the picture on the poster had the same shirt on that I was wearing. My daughter was mortified. She goes, "Dad, really?" So somebody thought it was important that I explain why in these 4 sessions you're not going to see me change shirts because I'm recording this all in one shot. So as we talked last week, we introduced the idea of the Christian and mental health with the simple idea that mental illness, true mental illness, is something that a person cannot control in their lives. Now, telling the difference between the mental illness and a chosen path or an unconscious path of dysfunction or maladaptive behavior might be really difficult to do. The bottom line behind that is that a person who has the ability to function and for whatever adaptive reason chooses not to is not mentally ill. We call that maladaptive, versus a person who does not have the capacity. If you want to think about it in computer terms, think about a hardware versus a software problem. In some cases, my MacBook Pro or my iPad won't work because it doesn't have the gig. It doesn't have the processor. It doesn't have something installed in it, or maybe I dropped it or I spilled coffee on it, and something is actually wrong with the hardware, versus here's a program on my computer. I don't know how to use it to the maximum of the ability. I don't know how to use it to the full extent, and so it's not really a hardware problem. Nothing actually wrong with the machine. It's just operator error. I'm not using that machine properly. And remember, our idea of what we're supposed to be using properly with our machine is do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Love your neighbor as yourself. That in and of itself says that inherent to the Christian ethic is a self-understanding that is then projected to an understanding of others. So then we have emotional intelligence, which says that I possess a self-understanding. I know what my emotions are. I can label them and respond to those emotions with self-regulation, delayed gratification, impulse control, and motivation. And then I can use those skills to recognize those things in other people and respond to them with empathy. So we're going to start tonight's session by talking about one of our general categories, and that's the idea of persons who struggle with a mood disorder. In our loose definition of those categories, a mood disorder talks about people who have a difficulty getting along with their own emotions. Typically, in anxiety and possibly even depression, if those two conditions are organic, if they are part of a hardware problem, then you've got some neurotransmitters and some chemical deficits in the actual brain itself, or the way the brain transfers that information to cause a person to become depressed, or to cause a person to be hyper-aroused, or to cause a person to become anxious. In the event that those chemicals are present and the person is misinterpreting what's going on in life, then rather than talking about an indigenous depression or an indigenous anxiety, we're talking about a cognitive depression or a cognitive anxiety. Let's just kind of do a case study of what I would call a spiritual depression, and let's look at the story of the life of Elijah. Now, when you study a narrative in the scriptures, a lot of times you take a narrative, and that's a story that God said, here's what happened in this episode in this person's life. God didn't put that story there probably other than just to give us the facts about his relationship with Israel and his relationship with these people, or his relationship and how he dealt with these crises. The ideas that we get from that are extrapolated ideas. It's not necessarily that the Bible put this here to instruct us on depression, But when you recognize what's going on in the life of Elijah, we can make some inferences, we can make some references, we can extrapolate the ideas from the material. So let's look at this chapter in the life of Elijah, 1 Kings chapter 19. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done, and how he killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah and said, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life as the life of one of them." So here's what happened. Elijah has called together the children of Israel. He's met them on Mount Carmel. He confronts them with their worship or their involvement with a pagan deity known as Baal or Baal, and he basically calls them out. He says, how long will you dance between two opinions? How long will you falter between two things? If God is God, serve him. If Baal is God, serve him. People don't answer. Elijah says, let me propose a contest to you. There's 450 prophets of Baal. I'm standing here by myself. Let's build 2 altars, put sacrifices on the altar, and then we'll pray to our gods. And the God that answers by fire and lights the altar, that is the God we will choose as a nation to serve. The people heard this and they thought, okay, this is a good contest. So they said, we're well with that. In the legend of Baal, Baal rode a chariot that was made out of a thundercloud, and his arrows and his javelin was made out of lightning bolts. So for this powerful pagan deity to light a little altar in Israel, shouldn't be a big deal. It should be a chip shot. This would be an easy trick. So Elijah tells the 450 prophets of Baal, you build your altar and you pray to your God first. And they do. And all day. From early in the morning till late in the evening. They build this altar and they dance around it and they pray to Baal. They cut themselves with lances. They make the blood flow. And in one of the saddest verses in the Bible, 1 Kings chapter 18, it says, there was no answer, there was no voice, no one paid attention. These people are crying out to something they believe is legitimate. They're crying out to something they believe is real. And there was no voice, there was no answer. No one paid attention. Then at the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah takes 12 field stones. An Old Testament altar was not anything elaborate. In fact, God had told Moses, when you build an altar to me, you don't touch the stones with a metal tool. You pull the stones out of the ground just as you find them, you build my altar. 1 stone for each tribe of Israel. And so you have 12 rocks, either 3 in a circle, 4 high, or 4 in a circle, 3 high. And you just build this little rock chimney. You put wood on top of it. You put your sacrifice on top of it, and you light it. So Elijah builds this altar, puts the sacrifice on it, digs a trench around it that will hold 5 quarts of liquid. They anoint this thing with water several times until there's 5 quarts of water flowing in this little trough. And then Elijah prays to the God of heaven. And he very eloquently says, please show these people that I've done this at your request. Please show these people I'm your prophet. And please show these people that you're the God of heaven. And while he's speaking, fire falls from the sky. The fire burns the sacrifice. It burns the wood. It consumes the altar. It licks up the dust around the altar, and it evaporates the water in the trough. The people begin to chant, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. They take the 450 prophets of Baal. They take them down to the brook Kishon, and they execute them. That's the report that Ahab brings back to his wife. He goes to the wicked queen Jezebel and says, you need to know that this prophet Elijah has called out the prophets of Baal. He won this contest, and he executed them with the sword. 450 men assassinated by this prophet because of this stunt. Jezebel sends a message to Elijah. I've invoked the gods that if by this time tomorrow you're not like one of my prophets, you're not a dead man, then I want the gods to punish me. How would you respond to this? What would be your response if you got this message from this wicked queen? There's a part of me that says I think I'd send her a note back. Dear Jezebel, meet me on Mount Carmel. Wear something very comfortable and cool. You stand over there, I'll stand over here. You ask your gods to kill me, I'll ask my God to kill you. Let's see how that works out for you. But that's not the response we get from Elijah. You have this event, the words from this female, we'll call it a precipitating event, and listen at the response it causes in Elijah. Verse 3, Elijah was afraid, and he ran for his life. And he came to Beersheba in Judah, and he left his servant there, and he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and he prayed he might die. And he said, I have had enough, O Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my fathers. And he lay down and went to sleep. Elijah goes from standing, literally having a mountaintop experience on top of Mount Carmel and dealing with these prophets of Baal, having God personally answer your prayer by fire, to allowing this message from this woman to send him into a tailspin. And he takes this message that Jezebel gives him, that I'm going to kill you, and if you're not dead by this time tomorrow, I want the gods to punish me. And instead of standing up to her, he lets her words have some kind of power in his life. He's having a depressive episode. Maybe he's even suffering a little bit from anxiety. Not from the idea that there's something wrong with his brain chemistry, but there's something wrong with his interpretation of the events. You see, anytime we encounter anxiety or depression, it's because we have a distortion of our thinking. Jezebel said she's going to do this. It must mean she's going to do this. In fact, when you think about how Elijah defines life, listen what he says when God asked him, hey, why are you out here in the wilderness by yourself? 1 Kings 19, verse 10. And he replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The children of Israel have rejected your covenant. They've broken down your altars. They put your prophets to death with the sword. And I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. Elijah can't see past the idea that I just killed 450 prophets. Elijah can't get past the idea that I built an altar to God and you lit it on fire with fire that fell from the sky as a response to my prayer. He's let this evil queen send him this message, and when he gets that message, he forgets about the things that have occurred, and he starts worrying, and he starts being depressed. He starts being anxious about the things that might occur. In fact, notice when he gives this little speech, he basically has 6 points. 4 of them are about other people. I am very zealous for you. He makes himself a good guy. He doesn't have maybe good self-insight at this point, where he's not choosing to use it because he makes himself the Lone Ranger. And he says, your people, the children of Israel, they've forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've killed your prophets, and they want to kill me. He makes all of his complaints to put him in this mood where, in an attempt to insulate himself, he isolates himself. He runs out into the desert, and then he cries that he's alone. Well, if you isolate yourself, and then one of your big complaints is, I don't have any friends, I'm not interacting with anybody, there may be a problem with what we call dissonance. And that's where you see yourself in one light, but the real look that you have is very, very different. It's the idea of our teenagers and what they think looks cool now. You know, if you're a guy under the age of 22 and you think you're rocking those skinny jeans, I can't wait till you're 40 and look back at that and see what happens. That's dissonance. That doesn't look cool. It looks this way. And so Elijah has this idea, this is who I am, this is what this looks like, but the reality is very, very different. We call that a cognitive distortion. And when we distort our thinking, cognition is thinking, when what she said is what's actually going to happen, recognizing that in his cognitive distortion, he allows Jezebel's words to have more power than God's word. And in fact, other people's words only have the power we give them. And oftentimes we are either depressed or anxious or afraid because of what somebody says, and we let those words be very, very, very powerful. We are living in a state of fear in our country right now. And we've lived in a state of fear. Our children have believed everything from the Soviets are going to blow us up during the Cold War, to the planet's going to burn itself up, to now we're all going to be killed by this pandemic. And when you look at the science and you look at the reality and you look at the impact, sometimes what they say and what's actually happening doesn't match. Well, so many times we suffer a depressive episode, and it's because our cognition, our thought, hey, here's something that happened, here's something that didn't happen, here's something that was said, here's something that wasn't said, and it means this. So many times people are depressed or anxious because of trauma. Trauma of when things happen to you bad. And typically when something bad happens, and I'll count this as a little t trauma for Elijah, Jezebel has threatened his life. And because he's afraid, that traumatized, because he's seen other prophets get killed, I guess. And so he sees this, and when someone does something or doesn't do something, says something or doesn't say something, and it affects us in a traumatic way, we come away from that with some beliefs. I like to call them implicit beliefs. Implicit beliefs are those things that we believe, but they're more felt than known. Everybody has an implicit reaction or an implicit belief about spiders. But when you really, really look at it, there's only 2 species of venomous spiders in North America. What color is a spider? Everybody would say brown or black, but in reality, spiders come in a variety of colors. And then you say, well, then now why are they creepy? Well, they just are. Sometimes we have these beliefs and they're implicit ideas. They're ideas that we kind of feel are true, but if you really looked at them, they're not really that true. And so this idea of, hey, this happened to me, this didn't happen to me, this person said this person didn't say that, I come away with a belief about myself. I'm weak, I'm powerless, I'm trapped, I'm a failure. We have a belief about other people. This person is strong, this person is powerful, this person dominated me, this person didn't care for me, whatever. We have a belief about the world. The world is a safe place, the world is an unsafe place, the world is a kind place, the world is a cruel place. We let those behaviors redefine or give us a meaning about our past. I've never been successful, I've never been right, I've always been a failure. And it gives us a belief about our future. I'll never be successful, I'll never be powerful, I'll never be acceptable. And then sometimes those traumatic events gives us an implicit belief about God. God doesn't care for me, wouldn't let this happen. God, don't you understand what they're doing? All of those symptoms are true with Elijah. He's a big victim of cognitive distortion. He looks at the world and he takes what Jezebel says she's going to do and he makes it more powerful than what he's witnessed God do. He takes what Jezebel said she's going to do and he gives her words more power than he gives the actual word of God. I'll repeat it again. Other people's words only have the power that we give them. And so when we get a trigger or a precipitating event or something happens in our lives, and what happens is that we go into a tailspin and we do what Elijah does. We misinterpret the events. We misinterpret the events and we run away. We, in an attempt to insulate ourselves, we isolate ourselves. Elijah's out here in the wilderness, and what's he doing? He's living in a cave. He's sleeping under a tree. He's doing nothing. When God finally confronts this situation, the 2 things that will happen is, number 1, the angel will tell him, arise and eat. The angel will tell him, you got to get up and you got to get active. If you're feeling like you don't have any energy, you don't have any motivation, if you feel like that because this happened or this didn't happen or this was said or that wasn't said, and I don't have the ability to move or act, sometimes when you're dealing with a cognitive depression, really the best treatment for that is to act better than you feel. Now, I'm not talking about being hypocritical, I'm not talking about being duplicitous, I'm not talking about putting on a fake smile. But I'm saying that sometimes you've got to decide that even though I don't feel like doing something, I'm going to do it. I don't always enjoy exercising. I enjoy having exercised. You know, it's like somebody saying, you know, when I get back in shape, I'm going to go back to the gym. I think you have to go back to the gym to get in shape. Somebody says, you know, when I quit getting out of breath, I'll start running. I think you got to start running in order for your breathing to change. When I get my life right with God, I'm going to go back to the church. Well, I think you go back to the church to get your life right with God. And so Elijah has this idea that the situation is Jezebel has this power. I have none. Her words are more powerful than God's words. What she says she's going to do is more powerful than what God has actually done. And then he's got this idea that I'm by myself. I'm the only one here. And nobody in Israel is faithful to God. They've torn down your altars. They've forsaken your covenant. They've killed your prophets. And they're trying to kill me too. What happens in those kind of episodes is sometimes they have to be confronted with reality. What happened? What does this mean to you? And then does it mean what you think it means? Notice what God does in 1 Kings chapter 19 when he talks to Elijah about this. Verse 15 of 1 Kings 19. And the Lord said to him, go back on your way, go to the desert of Damascus, and when you get there, anoint Hazael as king of Aram. You shall also anoint Jehu the son of Nimshi as king of Israel, and you shall anoint Elisha the son of Shaphat from Abel Mohelah to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death anyone who escapes the sword of Hazael. Elisha will put to death anyone who escapes the sword of Jehu. I have reserved 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed their knee to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him. Elijah's complaint, Elijah's precipitating event, Elijah's depression or Elijah's anxiety comes from a misinterpretation. I've let Jezebel's words be powerful. I've let what she says she's going to do be more powerful than what I've witnessed God do. And then he says, I'm by myself. They've torn down the altar. They've forsaken your covenant. They killed all your prophets. I'm the only person left. They're going to kill me. The reality is, I've got 3 guys. Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha. They're going to be out and they're going to be punishing people on my behalf. What it means to escape the sword means that anybody that Hazael doesn't kill, Jehu's going to kill. Anybody that Jehu doesn't kill, Elisha's going to kill. Elijah, the people who are going to be executed here are not going to be you. They're not going to be my people. My people are going to be doing the executing. Secondly, you think you're by yourself? I have 7,000 people who've never dipped their knees or pursed their lips. The old word for worship is to kiss toward. I've got people who've never even puckered their lips at Baal. I've got 7,000 people. Elisha's misinterpretation of what was going on caused him to get into this spin that we would call a cognitive depression. And so when you're dealing with a depression and you've got events that cause the depression, first thing is you got to ask yourself, am I interpreting them properly? And sometimes we misinterpret those events. Now, if something has happened of a tragic nature and there's been a physical loss, there's been a grief loss, there's been something going on with your finances or your job or your family, those things that impact us and cause us to feel bad, there's nothing wrong with feeling bad. There's nothing in the whole pantheon of human emotions that we're not allowed to feel. It's when we let our feelings become instructions rather than just information. Because see, once I have this feeling, oh, this is bad, that's fine. But if it makes me quit, if it makes me run away, if it makes me do something that's not impulse control, then I'm using my emotions not as information, but I'm using it as instruction. And that violates one of our parameters for healthy living. Do I understand the emotional experience that I'm having? And am I using those emotions with self-regulation, impulse control, delayed gratification, and motivation? You'll notice that this response that Elijah had to the threat of Jezebel, he did not delay gratification, he ran away immediately. He did not deal with impulse control because immediately he goes as far as he can go and he leaves his servant, and then he tells God, I just want to die. Then he doesn't have motivation because he's lying there asleep. Angel has to tell him twice, arise and eat, arise and eat. You've got more work to do. You've got a journey to do. So if you have a series of events and they produce some kind of problem, those emotions are natural. I would say they're not even they're natural. They're not just natural. They're normal and they're also healthy. It's our response to those events that get us in trouble when we start talking about, is this a true depression, or is it a situational depression, or is it a cognitive depression? In general, we're going to be affected by stress, loss, and guilt. And those things can be real or those things can be perceived. Guilt is when I try to be responsible for things I can't control. Guilt is when I make something that happened my fault. Guilt is that when something happens and I either take on responsibility and it wasn't really mine to control, or I'm guilty of something and I've repented and yet I won't forgive myself. That creates a depressive episode in lots of people. Remember, the Bible teaches that godly sorrow produces repentance that leads to salvation that's not to be regretted. And so guilt is one of the precursors for a cognitive depression or depressive scenario. Loss. Loss is the idea that when life does not turn out the way I expected, I suffer loss, and humans grieve on losses. So if this is my expectation and this is my reality, whether expectation is here, reality is here, reality is here, reality is here, when reality and expectation don't meet each other, we tend to have what we call a grief episode, and that's normal. But letting that control us for the long term, not making adjustments, not coming to our senses, not saying, hey, you know what, this didn't turn out exactly like I planned, but what can I do? What can I control? How can I respond to this? And so many times we suffer loss because of this inaccurate idea that if I do what I'm supposed to do, life's going to turn out exactly like I planned it. The Bible doesn't teach that. Hebrews chapter 11 shows lots of examples where there were people of faith and they had bad circumstances. Hebrews chapter 11 does not teach that your faith will affect your circumstances. Hebrews chapter 11 doesn't say that your faith will make good things happen. Hebrews chapter 11 teaches don't let your circumstances affect your faith. So the precursors for a non-organic, the precursors for a cognitive depression are guilt, loss, and then eventually stress. Stress comes from frustration, stress comes from conflict, and stress comes from pressure. You'll notice that in Elijah's situation, you have pressure. I feel like I'm up against insurmountable odds. You have conflict because I'm going up against this evil queen, Jezebel, and her husband goes to her and says, you know what? This guy prayed a prayer and God melted an altar on Mount Carmel. You think that in a normal situation that would convict her heart. If nothing else, it would convict Ahab because he might have been standing there as a witness to it. But when people don't do what we think they ought to do, we suffer from conflict and frustration. And so Elijah has all these things going for him that creates this mood change in him and causes him, in an attempt to insulate himself, to isolate himself. Now, if your depression is not coming from a cognitive distortion, if there's not some kind of a disappointing event, if there's not some sort of precipitating event that would put you in a tailspin like this, and life is going good, but you just seem like you live under a cloud, and you're always lethargic, and you always feel unmotivated, and you always feel unloved, and you're always tearful, that may be a sign that this is an indigenous or organic depression. And the best way to deal with that is using a professional and maybe even some medication. It is not unchristian, and it is not a sign of weak faith to take medicine for a depressed condition, especially if you can rule out that this is not because of some stress, some loss, or some guilt, but I've got things going well in my life, and yet I still feel bad, I still feel terrible. If you had high blood pressure, you take your medicine. If you had a diabetic condition, you take your insulin. If you had anything going on outside of any part of your body other than your brain, you take the medicine. Somehow we've attached a stigma to Christians taking medicine as a mood elevator or a mood stabilizer. Understanding and knowing the difference between the people that we deal with and in dealing with ourselves, as is this an organic depression or is this a depression that comes from situational, is super, super vital, super, super important. Now, I mentioned the word anxiety just a couple of times in this presentation, and let's go ahead and talk about that too. We have overused the concept of anxiety in our country. We've let anything that makes anybody nervous become anxious. And a lot of times it's simply the way we label things. you do realize that nervous and excited are the exact same feeling. It's just one has a label. You know, it's the difference in a rat and a squirrel. A squirrel is a rodent. It's got a fuzzy tail. It's cuter, has better PR. A rat, same kind of animal, but we don't like them. We think they're disgusting. We wouldn't eat a rat. Some of us would eat a squirrel. Yet they're the same thing. They're rodents. One lives in a tree, one doesn't. They all eat grain. They all chew on wood. You know, let a squirrel get in your attic. It'll do as much damage as a rat will in your basement. But it's all about how we label it. So many times we start mislabeling the things that we feel inside us, and we give them a bad label. If you understand just the physiology behind anxiety, when something happens and we are threatened, or we feel insecure, or we look at something with dread, we get a physiological change in our system. The physiological change in our system is our heart rate increases, our breathing changes. We get all kind of chemical changes that happen, everything from adrenaline to oxytocin to maybe norepinephrine that our body secretes, and they respond to things. And oftentimes we have those sensations and we panic and we think something's wrong with me. No, nothing's wrong with you. When your body goes through those changes, your body is responding just like your body's supposed to respond. Anytime you receive an assault cue, anytime you receive a threat, your body bypasses the thinking part of your brain, goes to the response part of your brain, and in order to do one of two things, fight or fly. Now, technically, it's fight, flight, or freeze. I think we've discovered that everybody freezes. Now, some of us freeze for a nanosecond, and some of us freeze for minutes at a time. But during that freeze portion, you're deciding, am I going to run or am I going to fight? And deciding that, your body has to prepare you for action. And it doesn't matter if you're going to run. It doesn't matter if you're going to fight. Your body has to make you alert, motivated, and strong. How does your body make you alert, motivated, and strong? Adrenaline, extra blood sugar, extra energy. Your heart rate has to change. Your breathing has to change. Your pupils dilate. Your muscles constrict. All those things that happen when we feel anxious are normal responses to the body. It's not that our body is doing anything wrong. It's number one, our interpretation of what our body is doing makes us label them badly. And number two, it's not just the interpretation of what our bodies are doing. It may be that our brains are saying, hey, this is dangerous when it's really not. We're saying this is scary when it's really not. Or we're not recognizing that my interpretation of this as an insecurity is causing my body to respond to that same thing. There's a phrase they call state versus trait anxiety. State is what you're feeling. Trait is the label that you give it. Joe Ledoux, in his famous book, Anxious, says we do not run because we're afraid. We tell ourselves we're afraid because we ran. Running is a normal response done from calculations. When something happens, this part of your brain, the amygdala, bypasses the thinking part of your brain, and instead of trying to figure out how much the bear weighs, or what color the bear is, what species the bear is, there's a part of your brain that simply says, hey, bear, run. And then you run, not because you're afraid, but because your body made a calculation and said, this is the best way to deal with a bear. Now, if the bear were closer, if the bear were right on you, you might put hands on the bear rather than run. That wouldn't make you brave. It would just mean that the brain calculated proximity to the danger, and the proximity or the immediacy to the danger determines our response. Remember, we don't run because we're afraid because we run. We've given it a label. Same thing when you talk to high-performance athletes. You talk to somebody who's about to step into a cage if he's a competitive fighter, or somebody who's about to step onto a football field or a baseball field or whatever, and you ask them about the butterflies in their stomach. Half of that group will go, man, I hate that feeling. I can't wait till the thing starts and they go away. Somebody else will say, man, that feeling in my stomach really gets me ramped up. I know I'm ready to fight. I know I'm ready to run. I know I'm ready to play. So many times we take the feelings of anxiety and we label them as something bad rather than just simply understanding, hey, my body's responding to a stressful situation, and my body's responding to the stressful situation in a perfect way. It's doing what it's designed to do, and because it's doing what it's designed to do, I'm ready to either have to run or have to fight or whatever. So many times we get so wrapped up in the physiological manifestation of that we bypass that. So many times in Scripture it talks about what fear does. You read the Proverbs, it talks about fear makes a man run into a pit. You think about the story of Haman. When he gets afraid of Queen Esther and her accusation against him, his fear causes him to jump over a table and land on top of her on the couch. And the king comes in from the balcony or from the patio and sees him lying on top of the queen, has him taken out and put a hood over his face and taken out immediately. Elijah is afraid of Jezebel, runs out into the desert. All those things are based on what's going on, and we let the fear in our bodies control us. Now, when we talk about anxiety, we're not talking about don't ever be afraid. Courage is not being afraid. Courage is the ability to act appropriately in the presence of fear. So when we talk about the mood disorders of anxiety or depression, it's really going to boil down to how you and I respond to those things rather than letting those things become controllers that make us do a certain thing. Next time that we meet, we're going to talk a little bit about personality disorders. And then our fourth session, we're going to get together and talk about some ways that we can cope and some ways that we can deal with either ourselves or other people when we run into areas that might confuse us as Christians in the area of Christians and mental health.